Good morning and welcome. My name is Geronimo Rodriguez and I serve as Chief Advocacy Officer for Dell Children's Ascension. It's an honor to be here with you today for what I know will be a very informative discussion on an incredibly important range of topics in alignment with the recent presidential election and ongoing issues our country faces. As we all know, and in many ways have likely felt both personally and professionally, 2020 has been a year of extreme challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic, social injustice, and political polarization that have each impacted our country and our world in unique ways. These extreme challenges have brought on the need for extreme change in many aspects, including healthcare operations and delivery of care, changes to our social justice system, and changes to our beliefs about the world and how we view those around us. This year, more than ever before, we as individuals need to take a critical look at our own civic engagement and how we are working to bring about the change we want to see in our local communities and beyond. As Chief Advocacy Officer, a major part of my role at Ascension, Texas, is identifying legislative issues in which we should be involved and encouraging our associates to get involved with. And while I hope many of you cast your ballots over the last few weeks to participate in the election of our leaders, both locally and nationally, the work is truly just beginning. We must continue to dig deep as individuals to identify what changes we need to make and also continue to engage in collaborative decision-making conversations to tackle community challenges and bring people together post-election. We need to continue to focus on diversity and inclusion, equality, and social justice for all individuals, regardless of their race, gender identity, or sexual orientation. What I would encourage each of you daily, and particularly for this discussion today, is to continue to focus on how we as leaders in our businesses, in our communities, and in our homes can continue to participate in and influence the civic engagement needed to bring about real change. So let's continue to work collaboratively to create a better community and greater Central Texas for ourselves, for our colleagues, friends, families, and neighbors. And again, welcome.
Thanks so much, Geronimo, and good morning, everyone. I'm Judy Maggio with Austin PBS, KLRU, and we want to thank you for joining Leadership Austin's Engage series. We have a very timely topic today. It is the 2020 election outcomes and looking forward, also taking a look at surprises from the election. But before we begin, we want to once again say a special thank you to our presenting sponsor, Ascension Seton, and we sure appreciate those thoughtful words from Geronimo Rodriguez, who is the Chief Advocacy Officer at Ascension, Texas. I have the honor of co-hosting these Engage conversations with Courtney Bailey, who is the director of the Engage series for Leadership Austin. Courtney.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to invite those of you who are watching via Facebook Live to participate in the conversation by typing in your questions in the comment section of this video below. We would love to hear from you. We want to get as many questions as possible, so please don't be shy. And with that being said, Judy, could you introduce our panelists for us?
I sure will, and please send those questions in, everyone. We call it Engage series because we want all of you to engage. You probably recognize our panel. They are nationally known, and they're also a return engagement for all of us. They were on our 2018 panel post-election, and we are so looking forward to hearing their observations about the 2020 election. So please welcome for a second time to the post-election Engage series, Dr. Victoria DeFrancesco Soto. She is the Assistant Dean for Civic Engagement at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Matt Mackowiak. Matt is the president and founder of the Potomac Strategy Group. And then we have Ed Espinosa, who is the executive director of Progress Texas. Thank you all for joining us. I know it has been a very, very busy time for all of you, and we appreciate you carving out a few minutes for Leadership Austin. I'm going to start with a broad question for everyone, and that is basically to give us your observations and reactions to the outcomes of the 2020 election. Dr. Soto, I'll start with you.
For months, I've been doing Zoom, and I still do that. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Courtney, for having us. And a shout out to my Latino Policy Development class from the LBJ School that is joining us today. In terms of the election, three big takeaways for me are turnout, division, and Latinos. So let me start with turnout. As Assistant Dean of Civic Engagement, Civic Engagement is near and dear to me, and the fact that we saw record turnout. In fact, we hadn't seen turnout of this level since 120 years ago. This is incredible, and this is a big win for the United States, regardless of who our president is, who is in Congress, who's in our state legislature. So a boost in turnout is incredible, and especially among our young folks. We saw that, and here in Texas, we saw a very healthy increase in our turnout, again, among our young folks who tend to not turn out as much. So that is a biggie for me. The second is we are a 50-50 nation or 47-52 nation. We are pretty divided. We are not necessarily a purple America. As you look at the map, it's kind of red, it's kind of blue. So I think this is important for us to think through what happens after the election and how we govern when we have two very different worldviews, two very different visions of what policy and government should look like. So that's going to be a challenge for us. And lastly, looking at an area that I focus on, which is Latino politics, Latino political mobilization. We saw a lot of interesting things happening here. One being the diversity within the Latino community, right? So even the Latinos, for the most part, voted for the Democratic Party. We saw some interesting pockets of diversity, which we can dig into throughout the panel. And also, shout out to my Latinas. We turned out in a lot greater numbers than we had previously. We tend to turn out more than our male counterparts, but we saw a big boost in that. So those are my three takeaways from the 2020, Judy.
Matt, I'll turn to you for your takeaways on the 2020 election.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate what Dr. Soto said there. I agree with all of that. I think that was smart take from the election. I would say there's a couple things that strike me. I think number one, as we sit here, it's pretty clear that Joe Biden has won this election based on the votes that have been counted and tabulated at this point. The pathway is really challenging for the president. He either has to find enough fraudulent votes cast in Pennsylvania to swing that margin, which may end up being 80 or 100,000 votes once it's 100% in, which would be unprecedented. Or he's got to win, the other three states, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona. He may win Arizona when it's all said and done. I think that margin's now down to, I think, less than 20,000 votes, with something like 80 or 100,000 still out. But the challenge is it's still not enough. He's got to flip Nevada and Georgia. And so this voter fraud, voter irregularity storyline that they're pushing is one that's going to run into a bit of a math problem at some point. Because you've got to find enough votes that would change the result in these other two states while also holding Arizona. So, but if you look more broadly at the election, obviously massive turnout, as Victoria said. I think the president got 71 million votes. That's 11 million more than he got 4 years ago. That's astounding. But Biden went even further. I think he's now at 75, maybe 76 million votes. And I imagine his popular vote lead will probably be in the 6 to 7 million range once it's all in. If you look at the Electoral College, it's really interesting. 2016 and 2020 are kind of mirror images of each other. If you remember, President Trump, punctured that blue wall with something like 70 or 75,000 net votes, providing his margin in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. If you look now, the total number of votes, let's separate Pennsylvania where it's going to be larger. But if you look at Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia, that margin is actually I think, smaller than that. So Biden found a path to the 270 electoral votes he needed. What's interesting is Republicans are actually, apart from the White House, very, very excited and happy and enthusiastic about the results across the country. Republicans picked up, looks like 15 or maybe 18 U.S. House seats, narrowing Speaker Pelosi's margin to perhaps 5 to 8 seats. I think most people thought the Democrats were going to pick up seats this cycle, and Republicans picked up a pretty large number. If you look at the Senate, as of now, we have to see what happens in Georgia on January 5th, but Republicans held their majority, and we'll see exactly what that margin is, but that's significant for the future. And then if you look below that at the state legislative races, we picked up a governorship in Montana, we picked up legislative majority in New Hampshire, we picked up the state house in Alaska. So the Democrats wanted to have a blue wave. They didn't. They did get the White House back, which was their number one goal in taking Trump out of office. But they failed to do a lot of these other things they wanted, and they had a lot of advantages. The concern about COVID, the economic shutdown, their significant financial advantages, the high turnout. So it's a mixed bag, I think, for Democrats. It's a mixed bag for Republicans too. There were some encouraging signs among them being Latinos, but some concerning signs for Republicans too: suburbs, seniors, et cetera.
Thanks, Matt. And Ed, finally, let's talk about the progressives in Texas and what are your takeaways? Unmute. There you
How's
go.
that? Are we
Perfect.
back?
Yep.
All right. Similar to what has already been said previously, I think that turnout is the big story, both in Texas and nationally. I look at this election in Texas as one that's very similar in other battleground states, in that it was a very close election, a near tie in many cases, in that we ended up with about as many seats coming out of the election as we had coming into the election. And in fact, here in Texas, we had a net gain of 0 seats in the legislature on both sides, and a net gain of 0 seats in our congressional delegation on both sides. So what you're seeing here in Texas is districts that are holding up to do what they're designed to do, which is to favor one party or the other. Now, what Democrats were able to do in 2018 and in 2016 was pick up a number of seats in the legislature and a pair of seats in Congress. And in 2020, they were able to hold those seats. So, not the forward progress that we wanted to see in 2020, but definitely able to hold the line for the gains that were made in the previous 2 cycles. Now, where we go from here, it's a good question. Democrats did neutralize the Republican advantage in the suburbs. Republicans used to get about a 200,000 vote majority out of the big suburban counties. Out of 2.6 million votes cast in those counties in this last time around, the margin was less than 10,000 votes between the 2 parties. So it's really, you're really seeing competitiveness in different areas. But if we're at a virtual tie, let's say, and if turnout is another big storyline, I think the third thing here that we need to consider is just the massive mobilization of small counties and rural communities really showed up in Texas, and they showed up in other parts of the country, which I'm going to say is a fourth storyline that we should consider, which is that, can we talk about the damn polling again? Because just like in 2016, it really was an outlier. And one of the things we've seen with Trump is that he has the ability to outperform his polls. And a lot of that is mobilizing these small towns and rural communities. He did it here in Texas. He did it in other states as well. Wisconsin was up by 11 points on election day, depending on the poll you read. It was decided a couple days later by 20,000 votes. So those are, for me, the takeaways: the turnout, the neutralizing of formerly competitive areas where the Democrats had a disadvantage, and then, of course, the polling in the small towns and rural communities.
So Ed, I have another question for you. So President-elect Biden may face a power struggle between the Democratic progressives and the Democratic centrists. On one side, you have folks who will be urging this new administration to lean in and to move faster on certain policies. On the other side, you will have folks who are seeking a less progressive agenda. Could such division weaken the overall impact of this new administration? If so, what can Democrats both nationally and locally do to remedy this division before it becomes too late?
So I don't think that the division is going to be a problem for Democrats. Clearly, there are 2 camps. You have a very progressive camp and you have a moderate camp within the Democratic Party right now. But the reality is that there is a Republican Senate, and you cannot get your cabinet officials through without sign off by the Republican Senate. Now, what I believe the voters said to the candidates this year was that we want the parties to work together. But the likely outcome of that is going to be 2 years of gridlock, and that's going to start with the confirmation process in the cabinet. So Would we like to get progressive leaders in some of these cabinet positions? Sure. Will one or two get through? Maybe. But the reality is that you're likely looking at moderate moderate leaders that would get into these positions. And look, Biden himself is a self-branded moderate and somebody who has good relationships in Washington. If anybody can make this work, I think he can. He's also proven to be a very good listener, even with the progressive wing. So, that's the landscape that we're dealing with. Now, your last question was, if that's where we're at now, how do we get around it? And the way we get around it is elect a Democratic Senate in 2022. And then the progressives can run for it, but otherwise, this is where we're at today.
Now let's talk about President Trump. He did outperform the polls, and he has his own style of governing. Some like it, some don't. But do you think his style of leadership has created fractures in the Republican Party, or do you think it's made it stronger?
Are you asking me?
Yes, Matt.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear if you directed that to me. Yeah, it's a great question because I got to be honest. I did think the election was going to be close nationally. I said I thought it would come down to one or two states, and on election night, it looked like maybe Pennsylvania and Arizona would be those two states. It looks like now it's 4 states basically. And I was actually just looking, just for everyone's just for context, I'll give you the latest numbers because I think this is important. So Nevada, you're looking at about 35,000 vote lead for Biden. Arizona, you're looking at only a 15,000 vote lead for Biden. And in both states, you're at 97, 98% in. Georgia is about 12,000 votes, a little bit more than 98% in. Pennsylvania at the moment is 45,000 votes, 98% in. So to your question, look, Trump giveth and Trump taketh away. I mean, this is the lesson of the Trump era for the Republican Party. He has made us a working class party. And that's a wonderful thing, because I think for a long time, the perception is we were rural and wealthy, but there wasn't a lot in between. And by winning over white working class voters in the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt and in the Midwest, I think he's given us a chance to be very competitive. His issue set has moved the party on trade, on immigration, perhaps even on non-interventionism abroad. It'll be interesting to see whether those positions hold over the next 4 years if Biden is in fact sworn in. Now, that's the positive. The negative is significant as well. I do think he has used rhetoric at times that has been difficult to defend, or even in some cases indefensible. My expectation, I think the expectation nationally was he was going to do very poorly with minority voters. It'd be interesting to see how he ended up doing with African-American and Hispanic voters nationally. We've certainly seen along the border in South Texas that he won Zapata County. He overperformed from 4 years ago, 25% in a number of those counties. We need to study that. I think as Republicans, we need to understand why that happened. Is it life? Is it the economy? Is it a desire to have a secure border? Is it a rejection of socialism on the left? Is it some combination of those factors? So it's going to be interesting to see whether, how the party moves forward if Trump is not, in fact, reelected, as it appears he won't be. Are these issues going to remain front and center? Is he going to continue to dominate the party? Is his son or his daughter going to run? Is Vice President Pence going to run? Is he going to run? These are huge questions. And as Ed knows, when you're out of power, you don't have one leader. You have a lot of people who want to be a leader. And so they go to early states and they write op-eds and they push, policy ideas. And you're leaderless for 4 years, at least for 3 years until you have a nominee, 3.5 years until you have a nominee. And so we're going to be in the wilderness a little bit as a party if Biden is sworn in on January 20th, as I expect. And we're going to be studying, I think, over the next couple of years. The question is, can you take the positives that have come from the Trump era and maintain those, but then separate the things that have been negative? And I think most of those negative things have been associated with his style, his approach, the way he speaks, the way he uses social media. I don't see a lot of other people in the Republican Party that want to emulate that. They may want to emulate the issues. They may want to recreate, the coalition he built, which got him elected against all expectations in 2016 and brought him a lot closer to getting reelected than most people expected in 2020. So that's the question. Can we take the positive? Can we eliminate the negative and move forward as a party?
Thanks, Matt. Victoria, this next question is for you. So a 2019 article by the Center for American Progress referred to women of color as a collective powerhouse in the U.S. electorate. What were some key trends and takeaways from voting patterns and participation among women of color, particularly Black women?
Right. Thanks, Courtney. Great question. Let me take a couple of steps back, though, to provide some context. The first is on this anniversary year of the 19th Amendment being passed 100 years ago, and then our 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act being passed, we've seen women who weren't invited to the game of politics until very late, making up for lost time. Over the last 4 decades, we have seen women in general outvote their male counterparts. Last election, it was about by 10 million votes. I think it's probably going to be about 10 million or more than that for this election. And then within that, we see very strong participation, very strong turnout, in particular from Black women. In 2008, Black women had the highest turnout of any group in the electorate. In 2012, rivaling that of white women. This year, I think we're still waiting to get the final numbers. So we know that women in general participate a lot. Black women have had very strong trajectories. And one of the other stories as of late is that Latinas, who traditionally, together with Latinos as a whole, have not been as high in their voter turnout, have really kicked it up. Data that I've been seeing from early voter turnout numbers for Latinos have Latinas making a big jump. Again, we're going to have to wait and see for all of the final numbers, but we're seeing, you know, the continued high levels of turnout for women, Black women in particular. I mean, shout out to the women in Georgia that really, you know, whether got that state for Biden or got it for Biden within striking distance, was really African-American women. And then in other states, you see Latinas starting to find their voice. I think this is very exciting, again, in general, for civic engagement purposes. When we look at how this breaks down partisan-wise, we see a gender gap. And we've been seeing a gender gap for decades where women, especially women of color, cleave toward the Democratic Party. In 2016, we saw an odd little blip with more white women actually voting for President Trump. Again, we need to wait and see what it's going to look like, but it looks like some of those suburban white women came back, but that gender gap stands. And if anything, you could argue that it grew among women of color. So women of color are an essential part of our electorate. And then for the Democratic Party, Black and brown women are an even more critical piece of that story.
Thanks, Vicki. I have a question from one of the audience members, and I think it's a really good one. And I'd really like to hear from all three of you on it, because everybody's moving forward now. We're looking at legislation. We're waiting for those 2 Senate seats in Arizona to see which way they go. But the question from Rich Laudenheiser, I hope I said your name right, Rich. Do you think the parties will be able to forge bipartisan policy legislation for things like infrastructure, climate change, those big picture items? Ed, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I can. I think when we typically think of infrastructure, we think of roads and bridges. And when we think of climate change, we think of getting out of our cars. So I think that depends on the type of infrastructure that we're thinking about. I do think that there's a possibility to move forward on infrastructure, because not only does this country need significant infrastructure investment, but that's the kind of thing that brings jobs. And we're at a moment right now where, you know, the economy could really use that sort of boost. As far as climate, it's going to be tough, again, with a divided Senate. I mean, you have some people that just don't want to move on climate right now. And by the way, the Democratic Party is not completely exempt from that. If they can find a way to move forward with some climate reforms or some reforms to address climate change without threatening or given the appearance of threatening some of the existing jobs out there, then they can do it. And I think the way to do it is to say, what is the forward-looking technology? How can we get into green jobs that get us closer to fighting climate change while also changing our reliance on fossil fuels? It's a tough sell in some places, even Texas, of course, but that's definitely the harder of the two things.
Matt, what do you think the possibilities are of a more united front on Capitol Hill? Joe Biden has a history of reaching across the aisle. Do you see some of these big picture legislative items having a better chance of compromise and common ground?
Yeah, so we are going to be likely entering into a period of divided government, which we've had the last 2 years as well. But this is going to be different. I do think the opportunities for the parties to work together are more readily available with Trump not in office. I think the breakdown between Trump and Pelosi, I think they hadn't even talked in the last year, which is just unbelievable to have, leaders not even talk. So, and I do know that the Biden-McConnell relationship is a good one, and they've cut deals before, not like transformational deals, but debt ceiling and budget and stuff like that. Biden is at least someone that I think McConnell trusts. He can do a deal with. I don't think he feels that way about Schumer, and I certainly don't think he feels that way about Pelosi. So the opportunity to do something bipartisan is going to be McConnell and Biden coming together. Now, that raises the question: is Pelosi going to be willing to move legislation that Biden is okay with, if she's not, invested and on board herself? And this is in reverse. That problem, was one we were dealing with Trump and Mnuchin, negotiating with Pelosi, basically Trump jamming Senate and House Republicans. So I think if you look at the issues that are out there, you're going to see a COVID stimulus bill quickly. I hope by the end of the year, you're starting to see even some Democrats, including Ro Khanna from California, urge Democrats to take the $1.8 billion deal and pass it. I think, potentially legislation focused on the economic recovery could be in the offing, perhaps extending PPP, small business loans, those kind of things. The big issues that Rich asks about, infrastructure, I think is possible. It gets to the issue of the difference between the way Republicans want to approach it and the way Democrats want to. Republicans want to do it through public-private partnerships, leveraging public money to bring in private money. Democrats, as I understand it, generally want to just do a large public works program, and that's obviously a much more expensive endeavor. And that would have things like prevailing wage and other things that labor unions would demand. On climate change, look, the parties are far apart. There's just no way around that. A Green New Deal type of approach is not going to get through the Senate. I'm not even sure it could get through the House at this point, given Pelosi's narrow margin. And I think for Republicans, our view is our emissions, our carbon emissions, are at a 20-year low right now. And that's because of fracking, if we're being honest about it. Fracking produces more natural gas. We're shifting from coal to natural gas. It's reducing emissions. It's happening not because of the Paris Climate Accords or anything else. It's happening because of innovation. Doesn't mean we should do nothing. But I think Republicans want to see what's being proposed, what the possible benefit is, what the real cost is, and to evaluate along those lines. I do think you'll see Biden use his administration and executive orders to push climate, with regulations, with other things, perhaps providing money to alternatives. So they're going to make progress, I think, through the executive branch. I don't know how much progress they're going to make legislatively on that issue. There's other issues where I think you can get bipartisan agreement.
Vicki, I'd like for you to weigh in briefly on the question about the possibilities for better common ground working compromise on Capitol Hill. But since your students are watching, and since I know that you are a big believer in the importance of civic engagement, I want to talk to you about young people getting involved, because we had just a record number of young voters turning out. But there's so much more to civic engagement than just going to the polls and checking off your ballot. So what are some ways that we can continue to get that young, vibrant voter involved in other things besides voting, and get them involved in policies and just civically engaged in general?
Right. So elections happen every 2 years. And the idea is, okay, if you voted, you check off the boxes, as you said, Judy. But the thing about civic engagement is it should be a constant. It should be an opportunity for you to remain engaged with your elected officials, with your government entities, whether that's at the local level, whether that's at the state level, also at the federal level. So I think this is incredibly important, and it's a two-way street. So, we can't just blame the young folks for not wanting to get involved, for not taking the initiative. We also need to blame our electeds. We need to blame our organizations that perhaps don't meet young people where they are. We need to figure out what the issues that young folks care about are, and that way connect with them. And looping back to the question by one of the attendees, climate change is something that young folks, we know from polling, are very interested in. To the points of my fellow panelists, I also don't foresee any large-scale transformational climate change policies coming through But just because something doesn't happen in DC doesn't mean that it can't happen at the state or local level. And this is a perfect opportunity for young and old to get involved in things that can be done at the city level, at the state level. In terms of what might happen in terms of infrastructure, again, I don't see anything big happening. There's just not the political capital there within this very likely divided government. So things will happen, maybe some infrastructure tied to increased stimulus funding, but nothing transformational. But back to your first question, Judy, it's about engaging folks on both of these issues, but at the level where they can be met.
You're looking at lots of gridlock over the next 2 years, but less tweeting. So we got that going for us.
We don't know, Ed. Hey, he still has a Twitter account. Trump will not let go of that account.
Less tweeting from 1600 Pennsylvania. I want to add a piece on civic engagement, and I think that what you mentioned, Vicki, is so important. You know, there's elections every Tuesday, actually elections every year, and many times when we have talked to people through my campaign work, we would ask them, "Why don't you vote?" And they'd say, "What do you mean? I always vote. I'm there every 4 years." Like, okay, well, it happens a little more than that. It's not like the Olympics. It does happen more often. But I think that's the thing, is that people recognizing that democracy is like a muscle, and you have to exercise it to keep it healthy, which means that elections cannot be the beginning or the end of your civic engagement. There's also the legislative process, whether it's Congress or the state legislature or your city councils, where a lot gets done. And then there's your activism in between. And those three things, the getting involved in legislation, being an activist at any kind of level, and being involved in campaigns, those three things are very important. They go together and they are year round. And if you can find opportunities to get involved in those things and get engaged, it doesn't have to be a large scale effort. It could just be something very local. It could be one issue, but you'll find that a lot of strength comes from that.
Thanks, Ed. So this question is for anyone who wants to answer. In his victory speech, President-elect Biden stated that this was a time to root out systemic racism. This was a time to stop looking at your opponents as your enemies. And this was a time to heal. What would it take for us to begin the healing process as a country, as communities, and as neighbors? I'll let Dr. V go first.
Sure. Thanks, Courtney. There's a lot here in this question. I'm going to start with probably the simplest, but the piece that I think is necessary. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. And that's of the rhetoric. When then candidate Trump descended down the escalators, he kicked off his campaign saying very ugly, very racist things about immigrants, about Mexicans. Regardless about how you feel about the issue of immigration and of racial justice and social justice in general, I think that as a nation, we need to walk away from those terms, because if you start dehumanizing in your rhetoric, if you dehumanize in your language that you use every day, it's a slippery slope into how your actions proceed. Because if you see someone as a rapist, as a criminal, as a thug, just by the mere color of their skin, then that allows for other things to happen, from police brutality to, not taking account into racial and economic equity matters. So I think at the very beginning, and I'll pass it off to Matt and Ed to build on this, is let's start the conversation in terms of how we are as humans, as human beings, not as criminals, not as rapists, not as thugs, but as human beings, and all of us as inhabitants of this country.
Matt, would you like to? You're muted. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot in that question. And, the question of racism in our country is an important one. I think it's one we have to chip away at. It's challenging because it deals with people's hearts, and you can't I don't see how you legislate ending racism. Racism is a choice. There have been studies about kids, small children in elementary school. There are no racist 4-year-olds. Racism is a learned behavior, and it's a values issue. It's a family issue. It's cultural. There's a lot there, and so I do think we have to be thoughtful about how we approach that. Obviously, there are challenges with policing that we need to address. I don't think we address them with a defund kind of approach. We do it really more from improving training, improving recruiting, improving policies. But the issue of unity and healing, I think, is really important. And this is an area where Biden, I think, has real potential. Number one, he has a lot of good relationships with Republicans on Capitol Hill. He's worked with them for a long time. He doesn't take cheap shots. He's not a jerk. He's a good guy, and he really does understand, I think, the importance of building relationships and maintaining them. And I do think he wants to heal the country. And I do think this actually presents a really interesting choice for the Democratic Party and the left, because on the one hand, you have the president-elect talking about healing and unity and reaching out, and even asking some of his supporters to go find a Trump supporter and reach out to them and talk to them. On the other hand, as I was just looking at my phone for a second, there's this Trump Accountability Project that wants to punish and isolate and really kind of almost with McCarthy kind of tactics, prevent anyone who ever worked for the White House from going on with their life. They want to harass them with their residence. They want to prevent them from getting jobs. That's not how you heal. It's not how you unify the country. So I think that's probably loud voices on the left that are pushing some of that. And I understand there's significant, what's the right word, anger and, fury at some of the things that the Trump administration has done over the last few years. I do understand that anger that's out there. But I don't think punishing someone who served in some agency somewhere is the way to unify the country. And I don't think Biden's going to be part of that. The question is whether he's going to be willing to stand up to his left on that. The single most important thing I've read in the last week, and this is a sentence I never thought I'd say. Ed, I'm sure you'll laugh immediately when I say it. There was a very interesting Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez interview in the New York Times. It's a Mad Lib sentence I never thought I'd utter, but it really is fascinating because she's deeply dissatisfied as a leader of the progressive movement with where the Democratic Party is, and she's very uncertain about what Biden's presidency will mean. And I do think, as I look at this, it reminds me a lot of the Tea Party difficulty we faced in 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, where we sort of lost control of our base and we were constantly at war with ourselves. I think over the next year or two, you're going to see that in the Democratic Party. They're going to have difficulty getting progressives in the cabinet. I don't think you're going to see Elizabeth Warren at Treasury, for example. I don't think you'll see Jay Inslee at EPA, for example. And they're not going to be able to do a lot of the things the progressives are going to want. Number one, because of the Senate, but even number two, with a narrow majority of 5 or 8 seats, when you've got a number of members from swing districts that are going to be more moderate, the Problem Solvers Caucus, et cetera, they're just not going to be able to get as much done as they want. So I do think there's going to be a constant tension within the Biden White House about how far they're willing to go.
Definitely cannot spare a single vote in the Senate, especially someone like Elizabeth Warren, who comes from a state with a Republican governor. And but getting back to the question of race, I want to double down on the issue of tone. And rhetoric is important. The way we say things to each other is extremely important. It's the way that we receive them, the way we feel when we hear them. There's a way of having these conversations and letting yourself be known where we can diffuse things. And I know that there's the phrase white supremacy that goes around quite a bit. And look, there is a problem with white supremacy, but the white supremacists are not necessarily the same that we've been conditioned to think of over the past 30 years. For instance, when we think of the phrase white supremacy, I said 30 years, like 100 years, when we think of white supremacy, we think of white sheets and pointy hats, but there's more to it now when people mean that, but that's not necessarily what people hear when they hear that phrase because of how we've been conditioned. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to express those feelings. I'm just saying that we have to find ways that people are speaking the same language. And I think that that's something that we're working out as a society right now. So tone is important. The other thing that's important is recognizing that racism exists. A lot of people think it doesn't exist or that they don't have elements of implicit bias. And the truth is we all do. And it's something that we're better off knowing how we can work through that and recognize those issues and address them. And programs like Leadership Austin that have courageous conversations as part of their programming, they're critical. The Undoing Racism programs that exist out there are also critical. I know that there was a policy at the federal level. I'm blanking on what it was, but it was about Trump did away with it in the past 6 months. And it was something about, can someone help me out here? Do you know what I'm talking about?
You're talking about the low-income housing in the suburbs?
No, defunding funding for training.
That's right, for
is that
training.
what you're talking about, Ed?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like those types of things are harmful. You know, like it's the reason those trainings exist is to try and get us farther along. But when you defund it or just have an executive order saying we can't do it at all, that's basically saying you don't want to talk about something or maybe don't want to acknowledge that something exists. And really the only way we're going to get better as a society is concentrating on our tone, recognizing there's a problem, and then actively doing something about it, not just wearing a t-shirt that has a slogan on it.
You know, even though we have a new administration taking form, I'd like for all three of you to weigh in on this question, and that is, the hardest work may still be ahead, right? The election's behind us, the hardest work is still ahead because we're still dealing with a pandemic. We're still dealing with an economic decline, so many other huge issues that we haven't seen in decades. So what keeps you up at night when it comes to the direction of the country, and what gives you hope? Who wants to start with that one?
I'll
Matt,
start.
you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to start. Yeah, great question. So what keeps me up at night, I guess, is a couple things. You know, one, the division in the country, I think is a major issue. And you're going to have probably half the country, or certainly 40% of the country, that's really not going to accept this election result. And so I do think once the president has worked through whatever legal challenges he files, and those are ultimately ruled on, it's going to be really important, if he comes up short, that he make clear that he lost, that he concede, that he welcome Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, to the White House and have the private meeting on January 20th, and then attend the inauguration. And I think anything short of that is totally unacceptable. As it would be, you know, 4 years from now if Nikki Haley beats Joe Biden, and it's a, you know, totally different situation. So the division of the country is very concerning. I do think Biden has the potential to bring the country together, certainly, but you know, I'll be honest with you, I really did expect violence in our cities after the election, and I'm so relieved we didn't see it. I guess my guess is we didn't see it because Biden won. If it had looked like Trump had been ahead, I think you could have perhaps seen some of that. But either way, we didn't see it, and that's a very, very, very good thing, and I'm relieved about that. But look, Vice President Biden's inheriting, President-elect Biden is inheriting, you know, a significant challenge with COVID. We did get some good news yesterday with Pfizer, and some additional good news this morning about the antibody tests from Eli Lilly. That's all very encouraging, but the trend line here is still very concerning in terms of cases, in terms of hospitalizations. The death rate is down, and that's a very positive thing. People are living and surviving COVID more than they were 6 months ago, and we're treating it better, and we have better treatments. But this is not behind us. We're not near the end. Perhaps by the second quarter, we could be in a place where, you know, frontline workers and the elderly and people with underlying health conditions have broadly been vaccinated. But this is going to be a challenge all year next year. And I think Wall Street's thinking maybe by the late summer, we could perhaps have this behind us and get back to reopening the economy fully. So that's a huge challenge. Then you add the economic shutdown. We've never had a man-made, government-mandated economic shutdown in our history. And I do think Washington totally underestimates the pain that's out there in the country. You know, for some people, COVID hasn't maybe affected them directly, at least economically, but for a lot of people it has. Small business owners, people in the restaurant industry, people in the travel and tourism industry. You know, there's a lot of areas that have been really hit hard, and those areas are not going to come back. Well, I think I saw 1 in 4 restaurants in New York City is closed. You can imagine what that means in that industry, all the waiters, all the kitchen staff, everyone involved, the investors. And the list goes on and on. And so while I do think Congress did a good job in those early months on CARES Act and all of that, they've really failed in the last 2 months to come together. Both have want 100% of what they want, and they're not willing to accept a compromise, and that's got to change. So What gives me hope, Judy, is we're living at probably the greatest time in the history of humanity. We have so many advancements technologically, medically, and honestly, the future is so bright and so interesting with AI, with all these technologies. It's just a fascinating time to be alive. You've had global poverty and challenges around the world that are being more directly addressed today than any time in the history of the world. And that's a tribute not just to government and not just to ingenuity and innovation, but it's a tribute to organizations like the Gates Foundation and the One Campaign and so many others that have worked so hard on this in places around the world that are challenging. So I have a lot of hope, and I do believe America will get through this pandemic, and we'll get probably to the new administration, and we'll have some political debates. But I do think the country has the potential to unify. It's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of time.
We want to get to an audience question, but briefly, Ed and Vicki, if you could tell us what gives you hope and what gives you pause at this juncture in our history. Ed?
I think the thing that keeps me up at night, that gives me pause, is civility, and the lack of the civility that's out there. I think that rhetoric hasn't helped. I think some of our media hasn't helped either, present company excluded, of course. And those are things that weigh on me. And I go back to a phrase from the immortal Bill and Ted, of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, where they just said, be excellent to each other. And I'm like, why can't we go back to being excellent to each other, even when we disagree? So those are the things that that give me pause and keep me up at night. Also, what's happened, particularly to the service industry during COVID. And I'm really hoping that the people I know and the people that we see that support our economy can get back on their feet quickly. What gives me hope is that I think there is, going back to something we said earlier, I really do think there is a willingness on the part of the voters to have the parties work together. And maybe dialing back the tone can give us the opportunity to do that. Now, we're not going to move forward in terms of miles, but maybe if we can even move forward together in terms of inches, in terms of feet, that's going to help us make some progress at some levels. And I do fundamentally believe in people wanting to work together and make things happen. So that's I think my optimism in people is what kind of gives me some hope.
Vicki, you want to take that one?
Sure. Well, let me build on Ed's be excellent to each other and add in the infamous Mr. Rogers, won't you be my neighbor? That is my mantra that I hope that we can put forward in the coming days, especially the coming years, in healing ourselves as a country. Judy, you and I have talked a lot about this issue, and this is what keeps me up at night, is what are the medium to long-term ramifications of the current economic recession stemming from COVID, what I frequently refer to as the she-cession. This is a recession that has disproportionately impacted women and disproportionately impacted communities of color. And at the intersection, the ones who are worst off are women of color. So, once we get the vaccine and people start going to work, that's great. But what about that tremendous loss of wealth, that loss of job, that loss of benefits? That's a long time. And heap that on top of the Great Recession a while back that again disproportionately hit folks of color. So you see this widening and widening divide. And that's what worries me. I think we're going to rev back as an economy, but that fundamental damage that was done is what worries me, and where I think that our policy and our governing needs to focus on the institutional fundamentals, on how to allow people to come back up and recover, whether that's through future of work training, whether that's through educational pipelines, but how do we institutionally support these folks who have lost so much, not just in the short term, but in the long term?
Thank you. So we are going to get to one more audience question before we go into the call to action. Dr. V, I see a couple of your students, Ana Ruiz and Juan Torres in particular, have similar questions. So I'm going to ask Ana's. Texas is not a red state. It's a non-voting state. After this election, what do each of the panelists think about that statement?
All right, Ana and Juani, thank you for that question. So Texas has had the dubious honor of being at the bottom of the barrel in terms of turnout. We have seen a boost in our turnout this last election. I'm still waiting to see what the final totals are, how we stack up. I'm cautiously optimistic that we've gone from the low 40s, maybe up to low 30s. That would be a win for us. So I think that Texas is on the move toward becoming a voting state. And in doing that, that's what is carrying it to a purple state. Whether or not we're going to get to a blue state status, I don't know. I don't know when that's going to happen. Are we going to be perpetually a Florida or a Pennsylvania? I don't know. But I do see Texas purpling, and I do see that correlation with the turnout. The turnout increase that we saw as a result of increased registration, we saw both Republicans and Democrats turning out more, but ultimately, collectively, we're seeing more voices, a tad bit more leaning on the progressive side, the young side, and that's what's carrying us toward that deep purple reddish state, whereas 15, 20 years ago, we would have never imagined that.
Thank you. Matt or Ed, you want to add anything to that?
Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, I mean, this time the turnout was great, and we're becoming a voting state. Are we there yet? No. We need to see it repeated in election after election to know if that's really reliably the case. As far as not a red state, we're a non-voting state. Well, our theory of change was that high turnout would benefit Democrats, and it did, but it also benefited Republicans. It turns out that a tide does lift all boats. So I think we were focusing on it only lifting one side so much. And look, Democrats did narrow the gap. They narrowed the margin to less than 6 points. That shows that things are moving in a more competitive direction for the state. I don't know if I want to say blue just yet, but it's definitely a purpling of Texas. But there are some barriers in place. I think that the fact that we're one of only a handful of states that don't have online voter registration is a problem. The fact that we limit no excuse vote by mail to people age 65 and up, and we're one of only a handful of states that does that, is a problem. Now, on the upside, we added a week of early vote this year, and it helped facilitate some turnout. And I thought that was great. So I hope we keep that extra week of turnout. I don't know that it's necessarily good for Democrats or good for Republicans, but I think it's good for democracy that we had 3 weeks of early vote. Imagine doing all your Christmas shopping on the same day. If all of us did that, just how congested it would be. Of course, we wouldn't do that. We spread it out. We should do the same thing with the voting. So we have a ways to go. Gerrymandering doesn't help, but look, it's a reality in politics that we deal with. For now, I think we're making progress. Yeah.
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, you had really unbelievable high turnout 2 years ago when Beto turned out and earned 4 million votes, and I think Cruz turned out 4.2. I was just looking at the numbers this time, and again, you had really high turnout. We're looking at, I think, 11.5, maybe 12 million votes cast once it's all said and done. Biden got 5.2 million votes, and my guess is the Democrats were as bullish as they were about winning Texas because they thought Biden could get over 5 million votes. So that wasn't an insane belief on the Democratic side. What's incredible is that Trump got 5.8 million votes. So, if you look around the state of Texas, rural Texas, there are a couple things to point out about how Texas turned out. One, rural Texas turned out not just in higher margins for Trump, but turned out heavy. And that was primarily election day, not early vote and not by mail. Rural areas, it's hard to vote early. They generally only have one location. In a lot of these counties, you have to drive several hours to get there. Election day, they have multiple locations. So that's number one. Number two, I think Trump probably didn't do as bad in the suburbs as Democrats thought. He definitely lost them, but it wasn't a wipeout like it could have been. And then third is South Texas, as we talked about. His margins along the Rio Grande Valley, winning number of those counties, narrowing those margins 20-25%. So look, the Democratic performance in Texas, I think Ed would admit, was really disappointing from their standpoint. They were expecting to take the Texas House back and win the 9 seats they needed. They were really confident about that. That obviously didn't happen. We're going to basically have the same margin we had the last 2 years. They put 8 or 9 or 10 congressional seats in play. They didn't pick up even one new congressional seat, and they really thought they were going to. They had 4 or 5, I think they were pretty confident about. They did win Senate District 19, Pete Flores' seat. That's been a slightly Democratic seat, so there's not a huge surprise, and that will matter in the Texas Senate. And then they failed at the statewide level, not just at the presidential level. They failed at Railroad Commission. They failed in a couple of the Supreme Court races. They failed in all the Court of Criminal Appeals races. It's not to say the whole thing was a disaster. They won a number of Court of Appeals races across the state that were successful and will matter. But overall, I think we can get rid of this idea that Texas is a non-voting state, and because of that, it will be Democratic when it votes. It voted in 2020 in unprecedented levels with huge numbers of people voting that we didn't really know much about. Probably 10% of the electorate had never voted in Texas before, either because they didn't vote, they weren't registered, or they're new movers. So both campaigns did a good job of turning out new voters, and I think those voters probably were about 50-50. I'd make two last points. Republicans did an incredible job on voter registration. We registered 150,000 more voters than the Democrats did since 2018. And I can tell you that took enormous effort. There was a super PAC, there was the state party effort, millions and millions and millions of dollars. It's very hard to register voters. But then finally, I think the ground game made a huge difference. Democrats at the national level decided COVID is too serious. Our candidates are not going to go door to door. And I understand why they made that decision. Republicans made the decision, we can go door to door. We can do it safely by wearing masks and socially distancing. And I think that mattered. I can tell you in Congressional District 23, where I was working for Tony Gonzalez, we knocked on 27,000 doors in the last 6 weeks alone. And that's compared to zero for our opponent, who we defeated by over 4% in a district I think most Democrats thought they'd win. So I think the ground game mattered. I think some of the national dynamics mattered. I think the Hispanic vote mattered. And I think rural Texas turned out in heavy levels. Now, I'm not pretending that Texas is, not getting worse for Republicans. We went from a 9% margin for Trump in 2016 to a 6% margin in 2020. So you can see with the trend line where it's headed. We have some work to do with seniors in the suburbs, different parts of the state. We have a challenge ahead of us.
Thank you, Matt. So we're going to go into our call to action. So each of you have mentioned that civic engagement goes beyond voting and political involvement. So I would like to know, what's one immediate non-political action that everyday people can take to make a positive difference and stay engaged in their communities and sphere of influence? And I will let Ed start.
Thank you. So I think you said one non-political thing. I think if there's an issue you really care about, or even one that you're just curious about, that you want to learn more about, find an organization and get involved. So say, for instance, you really love the Town Lake Trail, then find out if you can get involved with the Texas Trail Foundation or with the Hill Country Conservancy, which has trails all over Austin. If you're curious about issues of homelessness or want to learn more about the homelessness, go and participate in the Point in Time Count in January. There's lots of ways to get involved in your community where you don't necessarily have to get involved in a campaign or one side or the other, but you're still involved in the civic engagement process. Leadership Austin is also a great way to get involved. But there are so many things out there that if you look around you in your immediate circle, you probably have a friend or a family member that's involved in something that might be able to bring you into a Keep Austin Beautiful Park Cleanup Day one day, which could open some doors for other things. I think that's the easiest lift into civic engagement and activism.
Dr. V?
So this is a teensy bit political, but not super political. It's about getting outside of your ideological comfort zone. And so if you're a Democrat, engage with Republicans, engage with Republican media, understand what they are seeing, what they are reading, and vice versa if you're a Democrat. And one organization that I think does a tremendous job of this is Braver Angels. And here in Texas, there's a chapter, Braver Angels of Central Texas, that brings together folks on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, and helps de-escalate that toxic rhetoric, that hyper-partisanship, and gets folks to talk to each other and figure out that we have a lot in common. We have differences, but starting off from the point of commonality and then branching out into the differences aside from the other way around.
Thank you. And finally, Ed.
Matt.
Matt, I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I mean, my answer was going to be Ed's answer. Basically, I endorse everything he said. Although Victoria had a great answer too. I mean, I really do think everyone can be more involved. Literally everyone watching out there can be more involved. And I know everyone has, pressures and challenges, kids, family, work, church, everything you're involved in. You can do one more thing. And my question would be, why aren't you? Why aren't you doing one more thing? For us, my wife's real involved with Ballet Austin. She really believes in the mission. She's involved with their volunteer auxiliary Ballet Austin Guild, which she's been president of in the past. They do great work funding scholarships. I've been on the board of Leukemia and Lymphoma Society for 4 or 5 years after being a Man of the Year candidate. There's so many ways to get involved. And if you don't know how to get started, you can obviously look around. Philanthropitch is a good place to look. They have a lot of nonprofits that are seeking financial support, but that'll give you some ideas, some groups that are out there. But you can literally look on the Statesman or on the Austin Chronicle for nonprofits. There's a million ways. Reach out to the chamber. You can reach out to any of the three of us. We could give you ideas. But really, it's what Ed said. Find something you're interested in or you care about, and then find a group that's doing work that you think matters, because they need help. Every nonprofit that I know of needs help. And yes, a lot of it's financial, but you can give of your time and your talent and your expertise and your commitment. And that's a great way to get involved. We can all be more involved, and that challenge goes to Ed, Victoria, and I as well.
Thank you all so much. Those are all the questions that we have. We do have a couple announcements, but I want to thank each of you for taking the time to be a part of this panel and for the work that you do in our community. We really appreciate you. Our next engaged topic is in December, and it's on lessons learned from COVID-19 in the education system. So we hope that you all will tune in for that. If you have any recommendations or would like to see your question asked to the panelists, please email me. My colleague would drop my email into the comment sections, and I would love to hear from you. Judy, is there anything that you would like to say before we sign out?
Sure. I just wanted to also thank the panel and thank everyone who's watching today, because it's my belief that these types of discussions are what we need to open everyone's hearts and minds and try to move forward together and heal the country. So thank you all for taking time to take part in this, and for those watching today. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day.